July 19, 1940. The Kroll Opera House in Berlin shimmered beneath a blaze of chandeliers and overwhelming Nazi spectacle. Inside its grand hall, Adolf Hitler marched toward the podium with the air of a man certain of his destiny. The crowd of party elites, officers, and dignitaries watched with breathless anticipation. Behind him stood his senior commanders, uniforms freshly pressed, medals flashing like cold steel, each just elevated in a lavish ceremony that promoted 12 generals to field marshal, the largest such appointment in German history. Europe had bent beneath the Nazi advance. France lay defeated. Poland, Denmark, Norway, Belgium, and the Netherlands. Each had been swallowed in a lightning campaign so rapid it felt as if the laws of modern war had been rewritten in real time. Hitler now sat at the peak of his might, master of continental Europe, and from that throne of dominance he prepared to make what he portrayed as a grand, generous gesture. He would extend a final peace offer to Britain. One last opportunity, he insisted, for London to avoid devastation. But far from Berlin, roughly 600 miles west, another scene was unfolding. At 10 Downing Street in London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill sat inside a dim, smoke-thick room. A tumbler of whiskey rested near his papers. His jaw was clenched into the unmistakable bulldog grimace that had become a symbol of the nation's resolve. He didn't need to hear Hitler's speech to know his reply. He'd already made up his mind. There would be no talks, no bargaining, no peace, no surrender, ever. Whatever Hitler said after Britain rejected the offer would reveal volumes about both men and ignite a chain of decisions that would determine whether Britain survived the summer of 1940. Back in Berlin, Hitler began his address, a long orchestrated performance nearly 2 hours in length, crafted with calculated emotional rises and deliberate pauses. It was transmitted by radio across Europe, designed to cast him in the role of the reasonable statesman, the reluctant warrior forced into conflict by British stubbornness. "In this hour," he proclaimed, voice booming as translators scrambled to keep pace, "I feel it my duty, before my own conscience, to appeal once more to reason and common sense in Great Britain as well as elsewhere." He stressed that he spoke not as a defeated man pleading for mercy, but as a victor extending rational counsel. He declared, "I can see no reason why this war must continue." Hitler outlined Germany's dominant position calmly, almost casually. The Wehrmacht had dismantled every opposing army with horrifying speed. The Luftwaffe controlled the skies above Europe. Britain's military had barely escaped Dunkirk. Its troops evacuated, yes, but its weapons, tanks, and vehicles abandoned in chaotic heaps along the beaches. From Hitler's perspective, what possible path to survival remained for Britain? He leaned into this point by issuing a stark prophecy. Perhaps Mr. Churchill might, just this once, believe me when I say that a great empire will be destroyed. His voice softened to something resembling regret. An empire I never intended to harm, but if this struggle continues, it can end only with the annihilation of one of our two nations. He may believe that nation will be Germany. I know it will be Britain. The Reichstag roared with approval. Generals nodded soberly. Foreign reporters scribbled notes, some wondering, honestly, whether Churchill might now accept negotiations. Hitler had framed his offer as magnanimous, the victor generously granting Britain a graceful exit, a chance to preserve its empire and avoid ruin. But Hitler disastrously misread the character of the man he was addressing. Winston Churchill had become prime minister on May 10, 1940, the exact day Germany launched its assault on France and the Low Countries. He inherited a government divided by doubt, a military battered by catastrophe, and a public haunted by the wounds of World War I. Many members of Britain's upper leadership, including Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, argued that negotiation was the only rational course. Britain couldn't defeat Germany alone, they insisted. Better to strike a deal sooner rather than later. While the empire still possessed leverage, Churchill, however, rejected this view with fiery conviction. During tense war cabinet meetings in late May, as France's collapse accelerated and the British Expeditionary Force became trapped near Dunkirk, Halifax pushed for an approach to Mussolini, hoping Italy might mediate terms. Churchill responded with a force that stunned even his allies. If Britain's long story were to end, he argued, it should end with each of us choking in our own blood upon the ground. Not spoken for public drama, spoken privately to his own ministers with absolute seriousness, Halifax believed Churchill was reckless. Churchill believed Halifax was willing to sign Britain's death warrant. Sensing danger, Churchill took his case to the full cabinet, a group capable of removing him and installing Halifax as Prime Minister. Churchill spoke for several minutes, pacing with a cigar in hand, describing what surrender to Hitler would truly mean. He reminded them that nations that went down fighting could rise again, but those who surrendered without a struggle were finished. Forever. The members of the cabinet rose to their feet, some emotional, and vowed to support Churchill. Britain would fight on alone. That was 7 weeks before Hitler's grand speech in Berlin. Churchill had already made his stance unmistakably clear to the public through a series of electrifying addresses, words that echoed far beyond Britain's shores. On June 4th, after the miracle of Dunkirk, where 338,000 soldiers were rescued, though nearly all their equipment was lost, Churchill told Parliament, "We shall fight on the beaches, we shall fight on the landing grounds, we shall fight in the fields and in the streets, we shall fight in the hills, we shall never surrender." Weeks later, on June 18th, as France signed its humiliating armistice in the very railway car where Germany had capitulated in 1918, Churchill gave his famous declaration, "Let us brace ourselves to our duties, that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, 'This was their finest hour.'" These were not the speeches of a man preparing to negotiate, yet Hitler remained convinced that Churchill might eventually fold. Inside the German high command, many officers assumed Britain would come seeking terms after Franzfeld General Franz Halder wrote in his diary on June 30th that Hitler was puzzled by Britain's persistent refusal to make peace, believing London's hopes rested on the distant possibility of Soviet intervention. Hitler even delayed the Reichstag speech, waiting for a hint from London, any signal that talks might be possible. None came. British pilots continued dueling with German aircraft above the Channel. The Royal Navy maintained its assertive patrols. Churchill's speeches grew more defiant, not less. Hitler's July 1940 speech had been intended as his final grand appeal to British reason. He genuinely believed, or desperately hoped, that the government in London might finally accept what he considered undeniable reality. He outlined no explicit terms that night, but the message beneath the rhetoric was unmistakable. Britain could keep its empire, its sovereignty, its prestige. All it needed to do was acknowledge Germany's dominance on the European continent and step aside. When the broadcast ended at 10:30 p.m., Berlin time, foreign correspondents launched themselves toward telephones and typewriters, racing to file their reports across neutral capitals, Washington, Moscow, Rome. Diplomats dissected every phrase, trying to determine whether this speech might actually signal a path toward peace. In London, BBC monitors scrambled to translate and transcribe the German broadcast. Churchill, however, didn't even bother listening all the way through. He'd been briefed on the key points, and that was enough for him. "I will not negotiate with that man," he snapped to his private secretary, John Colville. The contempt wasn't theatrical. It was raw, personal, instinctive. To Churchill, Hitler was a thug, a habitual liar who broke every treaty he touched. Munich, the Nazi-Soviet pact, his pledges to Czechoslovakia. Why would Britain trust a single word he offered now? Yet Churchill faced a political dilemma. He couldn't simply dismiss Hitler's peace gesture with silence. The British people, tired, anxious, watching Europe fall, needed reassurance, and neutral nations, especially the United States, had to believe Britain's refusal came from principle, not stubborn ignorance. So Churchill devised a calculated move. He himself would not respond to Hitler. He wouldn't elevate the German dictator to the status of an equal statesman by answering him directly. Instead, he chose Lord Halifax, the Foreign Secretary, to deliver the official reply. On July 22nd, 3 days after Hitler's address, Halifax spoke on BBC Radio. The delay alone communicated Britain's attitude. This peace offer wasn't worth an urgent answer. Halifax's tone was icy, aristocratic, almost bored. "We shall not stop fighting until freedom is secure," he announced, as though discussing an unpleasant chore. Hitler's supposed offer, he declared, was nothing more than a summons to surrender. And Britain would not surrender. Even before Halifax's speech, British newspapers had already staked out the government's position. On July 20th, the Daily Express ran the blunt headline, "Hitler's peace offer rejected." The Times added a more dignified version, "No peace without honor." Truthfully, no debate had taken place, no cabinet reconsideration. The decision had been made weeks earlier. Churchill's resolve had already hardened into national strategy. When word of Britain's refusal reached Berlin, Hitler erupted. Albert Speer, Hitler's architect and later armaments minister, was present at the Berghof, the mountain retreat in Bavaria, when the message arrived. He later recalled Hitler's outburst vividly. Hitler was livid. He stalked back and forth, shouting about British arrogance and blind stupidity. He had fully expected Britain to at least open negotiations. The blunt rejection infuriated him. His worldview made such defiance incomprehensible. To Hitler, everything hinged on hierarchy and power. The strong dominate, the weak yield. Germany had proven itself overwhelmingly strong. Therefore, Britain, clearly weaker, should recognize the new order and negotiate. Britain's refusal was, to him, a violation of the natural law he believed governed the world. But his anger ran deeper than insult. The rejection created a massive strategic crisis. Hitler had never wanted a long war with Britain. His true obsession lay to the east, destroying the Soviet Union, conquering Lebensraum, living space, reshaping Europe under German racial rule. If Britain refused to quit, Germany would face exactly what the Kaiser's Germany had faced in World War I, a two-front war, the catastrophe Hitler had sworn never to repeat just 3 days before the Reichstag speech. On July 16th, Hitler had already issued Directive No. 16, ordering preparations for an invasion of Britain, Operation Sea Lion. The opening line of the directive betrayed his annoyance, since England, in spite of her hopeless military situation, still shows no signs of willingness to come to terms. Then came the order, "Prepare for a landing operation." But what stood out most were two small words, "if necessary." Hitler still hoped the speech might make invasion unnecessary. When Britain rejected him outright, that faint hope evaporated. The military consequences were enormous. The German High Command had been studying Sea Lion with growing dread. The lightning campaigns that had crushed Poland, France, and the Low Countries would be nothing like the challenge ahead. Invading Britain meant executing a massive amphibious assault across a defended channel, a feat Germany had never attempted. General Alfred Jodl, chief of the Wehrmacht Operations Staff, circulated a stark memo outlining the obstacles. The invasion had to be a surprise crossing spread across a broad front. The hardest part wouldn't be landing troops, it would be resupplying them afterward. No one believed Germany could rely on captured British supplies. The Kriegsmarine, German Navy, was even gloomier. Grand Admiral Erich Raeder had already lost much of his surface fleet during the Norway campaign. He had no specialized landing craft, no experience conducting large-scale amphibious operations, no way to counter the Royal Navy. Still the strongest navy in the world, Raeder gave Hitler a brutally honest warning. The Navy cannot guarantee protection of the invasion fleet against the Royal Navy. Unless Germany had total air supremacy, Sea Lion was suicide. That meant the entire operation fell onto the Luftwaffe. Hermann Göring's Air Force Göring, pompous and flamboyant, assured Hitler that the Luftwaffe would annihilate the RAF, smash British warships, and dominate the channel. His confidence was grandiose. His grasp of the logistical realities far less so. Following Britain's rejection, Hitler summoned his top commanders to the Berghof on July 31st. What unfolded exposed the disorder beneath the facade of German strategic brilliance. Hitler ranted about British obstinacy, then shifted abruptly to the invasion. He demanded that Sea Lion be ready by September, before fall storms made the channel impassable. His generals exchanged uneasy glances. Halder spoke carefully. "Preparations cannot be complete before mid-September at the earliest. We need landing craft, trained troops, reconnaissance." The Navy, he added, insisted it needed until mid-September as well. And none of it mattered unless the Luftwaffe first achieved air superiority. Hitler waved away the objections. "Göring assures me the Luftwaffe can destroy the RAF within weeks. Once we control the air, the British will listen to reason. They may surrender without invasion." It was wishful thinking bordering on fantasy. But Hitler had been right so many times, Austria, the Rhineland, Czechoslovakia, Poland, France, that he believed his instincts could not be wrong. German commanders were convinced, almost arrogantly, that Britain would crumble the moment German bombs began smashing into its cities. Yet in London, Prime Minister Winston Churchill observed every German movement with a cold, steady resolve. British intelligence was mapping out everything: the buildup of invasion barges in Channel ports, the relocation of German divisions toward coastal staging grounds, the rapid swelling of the Luftwaffe's air fleets. The signs were unmistakable. The invasion was coming. Everyone knew it. Churchill traveled constantly, touring coastal fortifications, meeting weary infantry units dug into wind-battered cliffs, visiting RAF fighter command posts buzzing with tension. He was 65 years old, undeniably overweight, drinking heavily, rarely sleeping more than a few hours. Yet he projected one thing with absolute clarity: defiance. Soldiers who encountered him later said the same thing. Churchill didn't merely hope they would win. He behaved as if victory was inevitable, as he told a group of factory workers tightening bolts on munitions machines. "We are fighting by ourselves alone, but we are not fighting for ourselves alone." He reminded them that Britain was battling not only for its islands, but for the future of the civilized world. Behind the scenes, Churchill fired off increasingly urgent messages to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He wasn't asking for American soldiers. Churchill knew U.S. public opinion was firmly opposed to entering what many called another European war. He was asking for weapons, destroyers, ammunition, airplanes, transport ships, anything that could keep Britain alive. Roosevelt wanted to help. He detested Hitler and recognized that a defeated Britain would leave America staring directly at a Nazi-controlled Europe. But he was trapped between his conscience and his politics. The 1940 presidential election loomed, and any hint of dragging the nation into war would hand his opponents a perfect attack line. So Roosevelt walked a careful, almost dangerous tightrope, providing aid while still claiming neutrality. The Destroyers for Bases deal, announced in September 1940, showed that balancing act perfectly. The United States transferred 50 aging destroyers to the Royal Navy, and in return, Britain granted 99-year leases for American bases in Newfoundland and the Caribbean officially. It was presented as a practical trade, not a life-saving gift to a nation fighting alone. Churchill disliked surrendering the bases, but he needed those ships far more than he needed pride. Meanwhile, the Luftwaffe launched a full-scale air campaign that would be known forever as the Battle of Britain. Starting in August 1940, German bombers and fighters hammered RAF airfields, radar posts, aircraft factories, anything connected to Britain's air defenses. Hermann Goering boasted to Hitler that he would break British air power in 4 days. 4 weeks later, the RAF was still in the sky. The battle was ruthless, relentless. Most RAF pilots were young, barely out of high school. Many flew 3 or 4 missions a day. They would land, refuel, rearm, and take off again before their legs even stopped shaking. Some were shot down on their first operation. Others survived dozens of dogfights, living on adrenaline and nerves that were close to snapping. Churchill honored these men with one of his most famous declarations: "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few." It wasn't exaggeration. Fewer than 3,000 fighter pilots stood between Britain and a German invasion. The Luftwaffe had more aircraft, but Britain had advantages Hitler had never fully considered. Radar gave early warnings, allowing RAF fighters to intercept incoming raids. RAF pilots who bailed out over home soil often returned to duty. German pilots who parachuted down were captured, and the RAF Spitfires and Hurricanes, while not superior in every aspect, were effective enough to counter the German Bf 109s. By September, Goering's frustration boiled over. Unable to break the RAF and enraged by a British raid on Berlin, he shifted tactics. He ordered mass attacks on London and other major population centers. The Blitz had begun. Militarily, it was a blunder. Switching targets gave the RAF time to repair battered airfields and rebuild its strength. But strategically, it tested Britain's spirit like nothing before. Night after night, German bombers dropped high explosives and incendiaries on London, Liverpool, Birmingham, Coventry. Entire districts vanished in firestorms. Churchill walked through the ruins, tears visible on his cheeks, raising his V for victory sign to survivors sheltering in underground stations. "We can take it," Londoners shouted to him, and they meant it. By May 1941, The Blitz had killed 43,000 British civilians, yet morale remained unbroken. If anything, the suffering fortified the national will. Hitler watched all of this in disbelief. Britain was supposed to collapse. The RAF should have been destroyed. The Royal Navy should have been crippled. None of that happened. Instead, Operation Sea Lion, the invasion plan, was delayed again and again, September 15th, then September 20th, then October. Finally, on October 12th, Hitler postponed the invasion indefinitely. The official statement said, "Preparations for Sea Lion shall continue solely for the purpose of maintaining political and military pressure on England." In reality, the invasion was dead. The Battle of Britain became Germany's first major defeat. The Luftwaffe lost more than 700 aircraft and irreplaceable crews British morale had not broken, and America had edged closer to supporting the war. Hitler also learned something he had never believed possible. A nation's willpower could defy military logic Hitler had promised. "I see no reason why this war must go on." Churchill answered through sheer resolve. The war must go on because Britain would never bow to Nazi rule. After this turning point, Hitler never again attempted to negotiate with Churchill. His attention swung eastward. In June 1941, he launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. He assured his generals that once Russia fell, Britain would finally agree to peace. He was wrong again. Britain held firm and now had the United States steadily moving toward active support. The rejected peace offer of July 1940 became a defining moment. Hitler assumed Churchill would accept reality and concede to superior force. Instead, Churchill demonstrated that some values, freedom, national honor, moral decency, outweighed raw power. Hitler understood tanks, territory, racial domination. What he couldn't understand was a leader who would choose devastation over submission, who would risk everything rather than compromise with evil. Churchill recognized a truth Hitler never would. Nations, like individuals, are defined not by what they gain, but by what they refuse to surrender. Britain in 1940 had little chance of outright military victory, but it possessed something far greater: the determination to stay free or die trying. That determination kept Britain fighting through the darkest years of the war. It inspired underground resistance movements throughout occupied Europe. It convinced Roosevelt that Britain was worth supporting and would never quit. When victory finally arrived in 1945, it belonged to nations that had chosen sacrifice over surrender. Hitler believed brute strength dictated destiny. Churchill believed that courage, principle, and unyielding will could stand against overwhelming force. The fallout from their conflict in July 1940 echoed across the next 5 years. Hitler had offered peace, expecting obedience. Churchill responded with defiance, accepting a war no sane leader would have chosen unless the alternative was slavery. One man believed power was everything. The other believed some things were worth any price. History remembers which one was right.